The Duke of Marchmont had been home from the peninsula 11 days when the county assembled at Marchmont Hall to welcome him properly, and by the second hour of the reception, William Ashford had already been given a hunting knife with a jeweled hilt, a snuff-box that had belonged to a minor Italian prince, and enough compliments on his survival to make him wonder whether the men who had not survived would have been thanked so lavishly for dying. He accepted each gift with the same fixed, exhausted courtesy, thinking of the 6 men from his own company who would never again be handed anything at all, until a slight young woman in a gown 2 seasons out of fashion approached the receiving line with something small wrapped in plain paper, and no maid to carry it for her. "Miss Colby, your grace," she said, curtsying with a steadiness that did not match the color rising in her cheeks. "I have not the means for anything fine. I hope you will not think less of the sentiment for the plainness of the gift." She held out the paper parcel, and when he unwrapped it, he found a small linen handkerchief, plainly hemmed, with a single swallow worked into one corner in careful, uneven stitches, clearly the labor of someone teaching herself embroidery specifically for this purpose, hour by patient hour, rather than someone who had simply commissioned prettiness from a modiste. Lady Diana Fenwick's laugh carried across the room before William had even finished looking at it, bright, musical, and utterly without mercy. "A handkerchief. Miss Colby? However did you manage anything so ambitious?" Several of the assembled ladies laughed with her, not unkindly exactly, but the particular laughter of people who have never once had to make something themselves because they could not afford to buy it. Margaret Colby's color deepened further, her chin lifting a fraction as she held her ground rather than flee the room. Which was, William thought, considerably more courage than most of the jewels in that receiving line had cost their givers. "A swallow always finds its way home, your grace," she said, quietly, to him rather than to the room, whatever the distance it has flown. "I thought, given where you have lately returned from, you might have use for the reminder more than for another snuff-box." Then she curtsied again and withdrew before he could find an answer worthy of her, leaving him standing amid velvet and jewels with a plain linen handkerchief in his hand, and the peculiar disorienting sensation of having been seen, for the first time in 11 days, as a man rather than a survivor to be congratulated. The rest of that evening passed the way such evenings always did. A dinner too long, a toast too florid, an endless procession of mothers steering daughters into his path with a subtlety that fooled no one, least of all him. He danced twice with Lady Diana Fenwick, because his own aunt all but placed her hand in his, and found her conversation clever and entirely without weight. The particular brightness of a woman who had been taught from the cradle that charm was a currency to be spent rather than a truth to be offered. He did not dance with Miss Colby again, nor did he seek her out before the carriages were called. But he found himself, twice more before midnight, patting the coat pocket where the small linen parcel rested, as though to confirm it had not somehow dissolved along with the rest of the evening's forgettable pleasantries. He put it in his coat that evening rather than in a drawer with the rest, and it was still there 3 years later. The war had taken more from him than the 6 men he counted by name each night before sleep found him. It had taken his taste for the easy performances of drawing rooms, the careful compliments, the practiced laughter, the assumption that a man's worth could be measured in the fineness of what strangers chose to hand him. He had watched men share their last mouthful of bread with strangers who could offer nothing back but company, and he had come home to a county that offered him snuff-boxes and hunting knives in exchange for having survived what better men had not, and something in him had gone quietly, permanently allergic to the exchange. He told himself, in the early months, that he kept the handkerchief out of simple courtesy to a young woman the room had been unkind to. By the second year he had stopped telling himself anything at all, only noticing, in the particular quiet moments that ambushed a man who has seen what he had seen in Spain, that his hand found the worn linen in his pocket the way another man's hand might find a rosary, not out of piety, but out of the animal need to hold something that had asked nothing of him and expected nothing in return. He had it near him at his father's funeral 18 months after the ball, when he became Duke in earnest rather than merely in courtesy title. He had it near him through 2 full London seasons of being steered, with increasing determination by every aunt and solicitor he possessed, toward Lady Diana Fenwick, whose £25,000 dowry and considerable beauty made her the obvious, sensible, universally recommended choice, and whom he found himself, for reasons he did not examine closely, unable to bring himself to formally court. He had it near him in the spring of the 3rd year, when Mrs. Dunning, his housekeeper of some 20 years, brought him a basket of mending and mentioned, with the studied casualness of a woman who has been quietly managing a household's small mercies for 2 decades, that the new needlewoman she had engaged for the estate's fine linens was a Miss Colby, the vicar's daughter, left in reduced circumstances since her father's death and glad of the work. William Ashford did not send the handkerchief to be mended with the rest of the basket. He kept it back, worn soft as it now was at every fold, and told himself he would have it seen to separately, later, by someone other than the woman whose stitches it already bore. He did not manage, in the end, to keep himself away from the sewing room where she worked. Mrs. Dunning, who had run Marchmont's household through 2 duchesses and now a duke, who had come home from war, changed in ways she did not presume to name aloud, had watched her master's small, private habit with the handkerchief for the better part of 3 years, without once remarking upon it, in the manner of a woman who understood that some observations were better kept than spoken. She had engaged Margaret Colby out of plain charity when the girl's father died and left mother and daughter with almost nothing, and had told herself, quite honestly, that the connection to the ballroom incident 3 years past had played no part whatsoever in her decision, though she had thought of it, once or twice, in the quiet hours of arranging the mending baskets, and had said nothing of that either. Margaret Colby had aged 3 years since the ballroom in a way that had nothing to do with her face, which was, if anything, more striking now for the composure grief and hard work had carved into it, and everything to do with the particular economy of a woman who had learned to make very little stretch across a very great deal of need. Her father's small living had died with him, leaving her and her ailing mother a cottage on borrowed grace and whatever pennies careful needlework could earn. She did not recognize the Duke immediately when he appeared in the doorway of Mrs. Dunning's sewing room with a basket of his own linens. 3 years and considerable exhaustion had changed him more than she expected, until he sat down, deliberately, on the table before her, a handkerchief gone soft and gray-white with handling, a small swallow still visible in one corner despite the wear. "I did not send this with the rest," he said. "I did not think I could bear a stranger's hands mending it, however skilled. I find I would rather ask the original needlewoman if she is willing." Margaret Colby looked at the handkerchief for a long moment, and then at him, and something in her carefully managed composure. 3 years of it, 3 years of swallowing humiliation and grief, and near poverty without complaint, finally, visibly, cracked. "You kept it," she said. "Not quite a question. I have kept it every day since the ball at which your gift, and you, were laughed at by people who have never once had to make anything worth the name with their own 2 hands. His voice roughened in a way that told her this admission cost him something considerable. "I did not know, when I put it in my pocket that evening, that I intended to keep it 3 years. I only knew I could not bring myself to set it down with the knife and the snuff-box and forget it. I have since concluded that a swallow finding its way home is a considerably better description of what that handkerchief has done for me these 3 years than I have ever managed to say aloud to anyone." She sat very still, needle forgotten in her lap, and something passed between them in that small, sun-warmed room that neither the 3 intervening years nor the whole width of rank between a duke and a vicar's daughter could entirely account for. She thought, in that unsteady moment, of the 2 years since her father's death, of the long nights nursing her mother's failing lungs alone, with no physician's fee to spare, of the careful arithmetic of candle stubs and coal that had governed every hour of her days since, of how thoroughly she had taught herself not to hope for anything beyond the next basket of mending and the next small wage it earned her. She had not permitted herself, in all that time, a single thought of the ballroom or the man in it, precisely because hoping for something so far beyond her situation had seemed the one indulgence she could least afford. "I did not make it to be kept, Your Grace," she said finally. "I made it because you looked at that ball, like a man being congratulated for a grief no one in the room had troubled to ask about, and I thought someone ought to have offered you something that cost more than money." "It cost you considerably more than money," he said. "I have not forgotten that either." He looked at her a long moment, this woman who had once held her ground against an entire room's mockery without flinching, now doing careful, underpaid work in his housekeeper's sewing room to keep herself and her mother fed, and something in him, something that had survived a war and a father's death and 2 seasons of determined matchmaking without once cracked open now, quietly, in the ordinary daylight of a working room that smelled of starch and lavender. The first crack came properly a fortnight later, when he found her in the kitchen garden gathering the herbs Mrs. Dunning had sent her for, and asked, without quite meaning to, why she had never once, in 3 years of occasional necessary correspondence about mending and wages, mentioned that she remembered the ball at all. "What purpose would it have served, Your Grace?" she said, straightening with a handful of rosemary, her composure returned but thinner now, worn the way the handkerchief was worn. "You are a duke. I mend your linens for wages that keep my mother in coal through the winter. Reminding you of an evening you likely wished to forget would have gained me nothing but the appearance of presuming upon an acquaintance that does not, in any way society recognizes, exist. It exists to me," he said, low, and watched the words land on her the way a blow lands, not painful, but disorienting, the particular shock of being told a truth one has spent 3 years refusing to hope for. "I have spent 2 seasons being steered toward Lady Diana Fenwick's £25,000 by every relation I possess, Miss Colby, and I have found myself, for reasons I did not permit myself to examine until a fortnight ago, entirely unable to want it. That is a dangerous thing to say to your housekeeper's needlewoman, Your Grace," she said. But her voice had gone unsteady, and the rosemary in her hand trembled faintly. "Society does not forgive dukes who fail to want sensible things. Society did not ask me what I wanted when it sent 6 men home from Spain in boxes and expected me to be grateful for my own survival," he said. "I find I have grown considerably less interested in what society forgives." He did not touch her, not yet, but something in the space between them had shifted, irreversibly, the careful distance of employer and employed dissolving into something neither of them could any longer pretend was ordinary courtesy. The county's opinion of the matter divided along predictable lines within the week. Most of the older families inclined to find the Duke's continued unmarried state a minor eccentricity best left alone, while the younger, sharper set, Lady Diana chief among them, watched every small change in his habits with the particular attentiveness of people for whom marriage was less a matter of affection than of arithmetic, and who resented, above all things, arithmetic that failed to resolve as expected. Lady Diana Fenwick, who had spent 3 years assuming her own eventual triumph as settled fact, noticed the shift before anyone troubled to tell her of it, the particular instinct of a woman who has never once had to work for anything sharpening painfully when the thing she expected began, unaccountably, to slip. What William did not know and Margaret only later came to understand, was that Lady Diana's interest in the match had never been merely sentimental. Her father's estate in Kent had been mortgaged twice over against a run of poor harvests and worse investments, and a duke's fortune was the one remedy her family had left to try. "I do not love him beyond what any sensible woman could manage," she confessed once, much later, to her own mother, in a rare, unguarded moment neither of them ever repeated aloud. "I needed his income considerably more than I needed anyone to believe otherwise, and I do not intend to lose it to a seamstress out of mere sentiment." She arrived at a small garden party hosted by the Ashcombes a week later, and made certain, within the first quarter hour, that every lady of consequence present had heard some version of the rumor she had begun quietly cultivating, that Miss Colby had engineered her presence in the Duke's household with considerably more calculation than her modest manner suggested, angling for a position no vicar's daughter had any business aspiring to. Margaret, who had been invited only as an afterthought to deliver a finished piece of needlework, felt the whispers follow her across the lawn like a change in weather. Polite smiles thinning at her approach, conversations softening into silence as she passed. She held her chin level and finished her business with the Ashcombe housekeeper with as much composure as she could muster, and did not allow herself to weep until she was safely back inside her own small cottage that evening, where no one but her ailing mother could see how thoroughly the county's good opinion, so carefully rebuilt over 3 hard years, could still be unraveled by a single well-placed word. It was there, a fortnight later, that Lady Diana made a point of seeking out Margaret Colby directly at the servants' entrance where deliveries of mended linen were customarily received. "I understand you are mending the Duke's own handkerchiefs personally now," Lady Diana said, her voice pitched for the benefit of the 2 footmen within easy hearing. "How industrious. I do hope you are not permitting yourself any fancies above your situation, Miss Colby. A vicar's daughter reduced to piecework is a sympathetic figure. A vicar's daughter who imagines herself the object of a duke's regard is merely an embarrassment, and I should hate to see you embarrassed twice in one lifetime, after that unfortunate business with the handkerchief 3 years ago." Margaret set down her needle very deliberately before answering, the same steadiness she had shown 3 years before in a ballroom full of laughing strangers now turned, with considerably more force behind it, on the woman who had once led that laughter. "I have no fancies at all, my lady, beyond finishing this basket before dark, so that my mother's fire does not go cold," Margaret said, evenly, though her hands had gone very still over the linen. "I would ask that whatever you imagine about my situation, you keep to yourself in front of the household. I have very little left in this world besides my own reputation, and I have worked considerably harder to keep it intact than you have ever had to work for anything." Lady Diana's smile thinned to something considerably less pleasant. "How admirably proud, for a woman who owns nothing," she said, and left without waiting for an answer, though Margaret noted, with a coldness that settled somewhere beneath her ribs, that Lady Diana's eyes had gone to the basket of mending with a particular, calculating attention before she withdrew. Margaret said nothing of the exchange to Mrs. Dunning, nor to William when she next saw him, telling herself there was no profit in repeating cruelty that changed nothing by being spoken aloud. She had survived 3 years of considerably worse than one spiteful remark at a servant's entrance, and she was not, whatever Lady Diana chose to believe of her, a woman easily frightened out of a position that kept her mother fed. But she found herself, that night, sitting later than usual over the mending by candlelight, unable to entirely quiet the small, cold certainty that Lady Diana Fenwick was not a woman who contented herself with words alone once she had decided a rival needed removing. The almost came a week after, in the same kitchen garden, dusk falling soft in gold across the rosemary and lavender, when William found her finishing the last of the season's herb gathering and, without entirely deciding to, closed the distance between them until there was scarcely a hand's width left. I have spent 3 years carrying a handkerchief because I could not bear to set down the one honest thing anyone had offered me since I came home from a war that took 6 better men than myself, he said, low, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard from him. I find I no longer wish to carry it instead of you. He reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a care that undid. In a single motion, every careful distance, rank, and circumstance had built between them, and she felt her breath catch entirely, felt the whole unbearable nearness of him crowding out every sensible objection she had rehearsed for exactly this eventuality. For one suspended moment neither of them moved, the last of the daylight catching gold in the rosemary between them. And she understood, with a clarity that frightened her rather more than Lady Diana's whispers had, that whatever this was, it had stopped being gratitude or curiosity on either side a good while before either of them had troubled to name it. Then a housemaid's voice called across the garden for Miss Colby, needed within for the evening's mending, and William stepped back as though scalded by his own wanting, leaving her standing alone in the darkening garden with her heart going like a struck bell, and the ghost of an almost kiss she would carry, she suspected, considerably longer than 3 years. The choice came at the summer assembly itself, 3 days later, when William Ashford, in front of the same county that had once laughed at a plain linen handkerchief, drew it from his coat pocket in the middle of the receiving line, worn, gray soft, unmistakably the same object, and said, loudly enough for the whole hall to hear, 3 years ago, in this room, a gift was offered to me that this county found amusing. I have carried it every day since, through a war's aftermath, my father's funeral, and 2 seasons of being told, with great confidence, what I ought to want instead of it. I find I no longer intend to hide that fact, nor the regard I hold for the woman who made it. He looked directly at Margaret, standing near the servants' door, where she had come to deliver a finished basket of linens, and had not expected to become, herself, the subject of the evening. Miss Colby, I would be glad if you would stand beside me rather than at the edge of this room, if you are willing. The hall went entirely silent, the particular silence that precedes either scandal or spectacle, and Lady Diana Fenwick's face, across the room, went the color of old ash. It was her own mother, Lady Fenwick, who broke the silence first, remarking to no one in particular that she had always found the Duke a young man of unusual sentiment, in a tone that made plain she had already begun, privately, to abandon the match she had spent 3 years cultivating. Margaret crossed the room on legs that did not feel entirely her own, aware of every eye upon her, and took the hand William offered with a composure she did not fully feel, but had spent a lifetime learning to project regardless. The same composure that had once held a ballroom's mockery at bay, now put to considerably better use. You are certain, Your Grace, she said, quietly, for his ears only, that you wish to make an enemy of every mother in this county in a single sentence. I have made worse enemies for considerably poorer reasons, he said, and did not release her hand. The gentleman who had raised his glass to Margaret 3 years before, at that same laughing reception, a retired colonel of William's own regiment, invited more out of old loyalty than present fashion, rose from his seat now and proposed a toast of his own, to a duke who had finally, in the colonel's own blunt words, had the good sense to marry someone who'd have shared her last mouthful of bread with him in Spain, rather than someone who'd have waited politely at home for the funeral. The toast was met with a ripple of laughter considerably warmer than the laughter that had once greeted Margaret's gift, and for the first time since the war, William felt the particular relief of a room finding something to celebrate that had nothing to do with his survival, and everything to do with what he had chosen to do with it. The cost came 4 days later, when Margaret returned to the sewing room to find the mending basket disturbed, several items rifled through, and the handkerchief itself, which she had insisted on keeping to reinforce a fraying seam before returning it to his grace properly repaired, gone entirely from the drawer where she had left it locked the night before. Mrs. Dunning's under-housemaid, cornered gently by Margaret's questions, confessed in tears that Lady Diana Fenwick had come to the servants' entrance 2 evenings past, offered the girl a crown to look the other way for 5 minutes, and left with something small wrapped in her reticule. She had gone first to Mrs. Dunning, hoping against reason that the housekeeper had simply moved the basket for some ordinary purpose, and had watched the older woman's face fall as she confirmed the drawer had indeed been locked, the key kept only by Margaret and by Mrs. Dunning herself, and neither of them had touched it since the previous evening. It was Mrs. Dunning who suggested, gently, that Margaret ought to tell his grace before the matter grew any colder, and who pressed her hand in wordless sympathy before sending her up to find him. Margaret did not weep in front of William when she told him, though the loss cut considerably deeper than 3 years' worth of mockery ever had, not merely a piece of cloth, but the one physical proof that any of it had been real, that a duke had once chosen to carry something of hers through a war's grief rather than discard it with the rest. William's composure, so carefully rebuilt since Spain, did not merely crack at the news, it fell away entirely, revealing a fury she had not yet seen in him, controlled but unmistakable. "She has taken the one thing in this house that was never hers to touch," he said, quiet and terrible. "I do not know yet how I intend to answer that, but I promise you I will." "Stop grieving a scrap of cloth long enough to act, Your Grace," Margaret said, unsteady but resolute, catching his hands before his fury could carry him somewhere unwise. "I do not need you to avenge a handkerchief. I need you to tell me plainly what you intend to do about a woman who will apparently stop at theft to keep what she believes is owed her, because I promise you she will not stop there." It was Margaret herself, 3 days later, who found the proof, a scrap of the same worn linen, unmistakable by its particular gray software and the corner of the swallow still visible, tucked carelessly into the lining of a reticule Lady Diana had left behind at the vicarage during a call meant to needle Margaret's grieving mother with false condolences. Margaret drew it out in front of Lady Diana's own mother, who had accompanied her, and said nothing at all beyond holding it up to the light, letting the ruined fragment speak for itself. The collapse of distance came that same evening when William arrived at the vicarage cottage, having heard, from Mrs. Dunning, that the fragment had been found, and discovered Margaret on the doorstep with the ruined scrap still in her hand, tears finally, quietly falling now that the fury of discovery had passed into simple grief. "It does not matter that it is ruined," he said, taking her face in both hands, his own voice rough with 3 years of feeling he had only just learned to say aloud. "I did not carry it these 3 years because of the stitching, Margaret. I carried it because it was the first honest thing given to me by someone who wanted nothing from me in return, and I have that far more permanently now than any scrap of linen could hold it. I have it in you." He kissed her then, in the fading light of her mother's doorstep, unhurried and devastating despite the urgency of 3 years waiting behind it, the kiss of a man finally setting down every careful distance he had built since a war he never spoke of. And when he drew back, he pressed his forehead to hers and said, "Marry me, and let the whole county laugh at whatever gift I give you next." I find I have grown very fond of gifts this county laughs at. The public reckoning came the following week. At a dinner, Lady Diana's own mother insisted upon hosting in a last attempt to salvage her daughter's standing, where William stood before the assembled company and recounted, without heat but without mercy either, the theft of a mended handkerchief, and the fragment found in Lady Diana's own reticule, watched by witnesses who had once laughed at the very object now proven stolen. Lady Diana, cornered by her own mother's mortified silence and the unanimous, unforgiving attention of a room she had spent years trying to command, offered no defense beyond a furious retreat from the table, and was gone from the county entirely within the month. Married off in some haste to a baronet in Northumberland, whose acquaintance, it was generally agreed, she deserved considerably less than she believed. Margaret and William married that autumn in the same hall where a laughed-at handkerchief had first passed between them, the receiving line reconfigured for a rather different purpose than the one it had served 3 years before. Mrs. Dunning wept openly in the front row, informing anyone who would listen that she had known, practically from the first month of the girl's employment, exactly how the matter would end, a claim no one in the household troubled to contradict despite its considerable embellishment. Margaret's mother, recovered enough by careful care and better coal to attend, watched her daughter married to a duke with an expression of quiet, disbelieving joy, and gripped Margaret's hand so tightly before the ceremony that Margaret laughingly accused her of trying to keep her from bolting. "I am trying to keep myself steady, not you," her mother said. "I have waited 2 years to see you looked after properly, and I find I do not entirely trust my own legs to manage the emotion of it." Sir Josiah, the Marchmont solicitor who had once drawn up the settlement for Lady Diana with every expectation of a considerably grander wedding to record, drew up Margaret's marriage settlement instead with what he privately confided to Mrs. Dunning was rather more satisfaction than his profession generally permitted him to feel about any single document. William settled a sum on Margaret's mother sufficient to keep her in comfort and good coal for the whole of her remaining years, a provision Margaret had not asked for and which moved her, when she learned of it, considerably more than any of the jewels she had once watched other ladies present at that long-ago ball. Lady Diana Fenwick's marriage to the Northumberland baronet was reported, within the year, to be a considerably duller arrangement than the ambitious match she had spent 3 seasons pursuing, though her family's Kent estate was said to have been quietly rescued from its mortgages regardless. A small, ordinary mercy Margaret found she could extend even to a woman who had stolen from her, once she had stopped being afraid of what that woman could still take. A year later, in the same kitchen garden where he had once nearly kissed her among the rosemary, William found Margaret with a new handkerchief in her lap. Finer linen now, though she had insisted on working the swallow herself rather than trusting it to a modiste, and a small folded scrap of gray soft, ruined original linen stitched carefully into its hem where no one would see it but the two of them. "I did not want to lose it entirely," she said, when he asked. "Even ruined, it did more work than any whole thing I have ever made." He said nothing at all, only took her hand and pressed it, in front of the swallows nesting again under the garden eaves, to his heart, exactly where the original had rested for 3 quiet, carrying years. Their own daughter, not yet a year old, slept in a basket nearby in the shade of the same rosemary bed, and Margaret thought, watching her husband's hand over hers, that whatever the county had once found so amusing about a plain linen handkerchief, none of them laughed at it now, least of all the man who had carried it through a war's grief, a father's funeral, and 3 long years of learning how to want something honestly again.